I'm sure you've seen by now, I put a $10,000 speedrun bounty on a game no one has ever played besides me, and it was an amazing experience. I want to go over the history of this speedrun competition. It lasted 2 weeks, and I'm pretty sure the stories will last a lifetime. Amok Runner, a name that'll go down in history as one of the finest creations of the modern age. Should humans ever go extinct, I hope the only thing we leave behind is a copy of this game. This is the speedrun world record history of the best speedrunning game ever discovered.
Linda, listen, I got the morphine that you asked for. I know that you're dying, but... Oh god, what the f- What is happening?
The glitches in this game are the most cursed shit out of any game I've ever fucking played. It's just...
I found this game on a stream randomly while perusing the new releases on Steam. Most of them are stinkers, but this time we got lucky. I found a diamond in the rough. I was the first to complete this game probably in the world. I probably am the first one ever to finish it, including the developer. I probably beat it before he did. And this fucking thing I knew was special from the get-go. It's hard to fit a game of this magnitude into a single genre. I liken it to something like Death Stranding, how it's a Stranding type game. This is an Amok type game. I'll address the elephant in the room. I know it's not actually pronounced Amok, it's more like Amok or Amok, but I just think it sounds so much cooler that way. Now, it's based on a book of the same name, and I don't know how closely it follows that story, but I'll break it down for you. You're a doctor in a town that hasn't been visited by a woman in a long time, which led to the iconic line from the game,
"A lady in this town?"
Her name is Linda, and she's coming to you, the doctor, because she's looking to have a discreet abortion performed. However, you conduct yourself unprofessionally, and it scares her away. You become obsessed, you chase her around, eventually she gets an abortion from a shady place and dies as a result. No! Ah! Linda! You are overcome with guilt for this whole situation, and you end up pushing her coffin into the sea to hide her secret, and then kill yourself as well. It's a tragic story, and the name comes from the syndrome or disease that's inflicted the town that's turning them into like mindless killers. It's the Amok syndrome, so doesn't really play much of a role in the story, but you know, it's there. Now that you know what the game's about, let me show you my ass. I thought this would be a fun challenge because no one's played this game, and I had a feeling it would actually turn out to have some really cool glitches and tech that would lead to really interesting speedruns, and I was kind of right. So I put a $10,000 bounty on it. Whoever could finish the game fastest in a 2-week time period would take home the grand prize. I divided it amongst the top 3 because that's what the runners decided would be best, and I wanted at the end of the day for this to be something fun and celebrated by the speedrun community. So instead of just giving a $10,000 lump sum to first place, I did $6,000 to first, $2.5k to second, and $1.5k to third. And the competition was fierce. It all started with a glitch that I found myself, a glitch that the community dubbed Moist Skip. After I beat the game, I had a suspicion that I could actually just skip to the end of the game right from the game's intro, because the final scene takes place where the game begins. I really feel like if I can just get on that ship at the beginning of the game, I'll get right to the end. Let's see if the coffin's there. It is! I bet if I can find a way to glitch over to that coffin, it'll activate. So now we just need to find a way over there. So there's a coffin that's just out of reach from the starting ship, so if I could just slam together all the brain cells in my little noodle and find a way to get to that coffin, I assumed I would trigger the final cutscene. So I immediately found a way of getting there by clipping onto this staircase using this little life raft. On the rail, stay on the rail. Oh, he really wants to fall. And the prompt is there, so I pushed it, but the game didn't end. It didn't actually trigger the final cutscene, and the reason for that is because it turns out this game actually uses a very strict checkpoint / flagging system, so sequence breaks ended up being impossible. No! The cutscene doesn't play. Why? Push it! No! Because the game won't load the next shit unless you do the previous shit. So if you don't complete the current objective, you can't complete any other objectives. It's cutthroat. I didn't know that at the time, but this discovery still did have some use, but it was very risky because the angle you had to take was super specific. And it could only be used at the very end of the game and saves approximately 4 seconds. This was the genesis of AMOC runner speedrunning. Day 1 of the competition was fucking chaotic. It was an absolute mess. It was like a Jackson Pollock painting of world records. Just world records all over the place. Most people spent the first day just figuring out what the game even was, playing it normally for the first time, figuring out how the game works, just kind of going over like the most bare essentials of AMOC Runner. The first records were in the hour ballpark. Shortly after those were clocked in, there were some coming in at 50 minutes, then 40 minutes, and then we started getting in the wacky zone in the 30-minute ballpark. The fastest time clocked in was by a streamer named Dizzy, who got a 32:21 and absolutely steamed some ham. Dizzy is probably a name you're familiar with. He's an extremely talented gamer, especially when it comes to shooters, and he put his expertise to the test in a game like no other. Now, his run didn't utilize any crazy glitches or tech. It was mainly just optimizing the route that he was taking to get from checkpoint to checkpoint, but there were a couple of very important discoveries made on day 1. One of them is a trick that was used all the way up until the final day. It's called Linda Skip. In the beginning of the game, once you're in the clinic, Linda pays you a visit, and man, she's a real chatty Cathy, I'll tell you what. She has this like minute 30-second long fucking monologue that you can't skip through. However, if you wait until she gets into your office and then make a mad dash to the door at the right time, you can actually squeeze out of the door before it locks, trapping you in there with her in order to continue the dialogue. This saves you a handful of seconds, and it's actually an extremely important skip to hit. The way that most runners line it up is they look at Linda's feet in order to get the timing correct, and then they just blast through the door. And if you miss this, you instantly have to reset. You don't stand a chance of even having a good run. It's dead in the water immediately. Then you have to go through the unskippable intro again, which is just pure pain. Linda Skip is extremely important, and it was discovered on day 1. Another important discovery for day 1 was Dane Skip. You get chased around by this absolute fucking maniac, this AMOC zombie who's hitting you with an axe, and runners discovered that if you go into the cabin and go out at the perfect time, you get to clip through the cabin door and you skip the encounter, and saves you a handful of seconds. And after putting these new discoveries to the test, we had a bunch of other world records come in. Spicy TV gets a 31:10. Shortly after that, he then gets a 30:36. Then we have a new titan come in. His name is Zach777, who comes in with a meaty 30:35. Another new runner named Deet D gets a 30:32. Esno gets a 30:26. And this was an interesting one because this was the first use of a music mute, which was discovered to actually save time through Linda's death. So if you mute the in-game music, you actually save time because it makes Linda's death a little bit quicker. After Esno gets the 30:26, Dizzy comes back to reclaim the glory with the first sub-30. which was a 29:50. But Spicy TV, not to be outdone, comes around the corner with a furious 29:45. Then Zach comes out of the shadows once more with a 29:43, beating his own record again right after that with a 29:41. And then finally, finishing day one, the fastest time at the end of the 24 hours since the competition was posted, was held by Spicy TV with a 29:17. A fucking crazy day one, honestly. Very turbulent. The next 3 days were mainly spent with runners optimizing the current route, so just finding the best paths for driving as well as the most effective lines for walking to get you to the destinations quickest. However, there were 3 key discoveries. One of them was a different route taken from the train station to your house that allows you to completely skip the entire Dane encounter. So he just gets banished to the fucking Shadow Realm. You don't even have to see him if you just walk in a different direction, and it saves a handful of seconds. So that became used by every run from this point forward. Another one is Graveyard Skip, which is towards the very end of the run when you're being chased and shot at by the police. There is a cutscene that plays right before you get to the final boss fight. However, you can skip that cutscene by just simply walking out of bounds and just kind of like grinding on the barrier outside of it. So it saves you about 3 to 7 seconds on that entire cutscene. So that also got used for every run from this point going forward. But I think the biggest discovery is Fisherman Skip. Now, in my opinion, this is the holy grail of AMOC runner glitch discoveries because this was really the first major innovation. This is like the actual Higgs boson particle here. It was found by Pwn Noobs, and what you do is you drive your bike into this wall, and when you get off your bike, you collide with the fisherman and get an upwards launch which can take you all the way to the train station, and it saves you like 30 seconds, which in this game is an eternity. The game may have runner in its name, but don't be fooled. The running speed in this game is about a 90-year-old man's walking speed. It is brutal how slow you move in this game. So finding this was huge because it gets you to the train station much faster. But not only was it just great for that intro, it actually had such a wide range of uses because this was a mechanic that could be translated elsewhere, and it did. This became kind of the focal point of AMOC runner speedrunning, mastering these launches. Now, unfortunately, this was a little controversial because this launch was improved by better PCs, so if you had high frames, you could get this launch much more consistently than someone that doesn't. So this led to our very first Discord drama, our massive little war that was held on the AMOC runner battlefield, and eventually we made the decision to limit the FPS to 60, so all runners had to run the game at 60 FPS, so that way it was even across the board. This was a tough decision that required hours upon hours of deliberation in the Speedrun Bounty headquarters. It was like the United Nations getting together to ultimately come to this conclusion. The majority of the runners were in favor of the change because it's a $10,000 competition, and it seemed unfair that someone that just had more money to begin with better hardware had an advantage over the others that didn't have the same hardware. So, with this new change in mind, new discoveries and new routes started to be theory crafted, but let me give you a rundown of the world records for the first 4 days. So after Spicy gets his 29:17 on day 1, he then comes back in the following day to beat it with a 29-minute flat, and then Zach hits the first sub 29 with a 28:58. At this point, it's becoming clear to everyone who the front runners are here to win. It's Spicy TV and Zach who are trading world records back and forth like they're fucking Pokemon cards. But then, 2 new athletes enter the Thunderdome. Distortion 2, one of the biggest names in all of speedrunning, decides to put his talents to the test in the AMOC runner field, and he starts practicing all of the glitches, specifically Fisherman Skip. I watched for hours as he just banged his head against a fucking wall trying to get that consistent. It is an absolutely brutal trick. It is so precise and so unforgiving, you'd have better luck winning the lottery twice than hitting that in an actual run consistently. But Distortion was determined to make magic happen and master the trick, so he kept trying to get it consistent, and he got very good at the launch mechanic in general. He didn't post any world records in the first 4 days, he instead spent that time trying to master the tricks. However, the other runner who came in is one that I'm sure everyone knows if you follow Super Mario 64 speedrunning. It's Ouija. Ouija came in and did like a 35-hour fucking marathon stream of Amok Runner, and he posted a 28:48, taking the record from Zach. But Zach came back with a furious vengeance, who grinded it down to a 28:46 the same day, and then a 28:35 hours later, and then a 28:29 shortly after that. It's important to note that none of these world records up till this point had utilized the recently discovered Fisherman launch just because of how inconsistent and risky it was. Plus, no one likes resetting in this game because then you have to go through like a minute and a half unskippable intro, which is just mind-numbingly fucking painful. It's brutal. So most people didn't bother during a run. However, Zach now got the world record 3 times in a row across that day, so he decided to get a little goofy. He had some time to play around and get wacky, so he did decide to start trying the Fisherman launch during runs, and he hit a mean one.
This works. Oh my god. Jesus Christ. Oh my.
Zach gets the Fisherman launch and then goes through with his tried and true established route that he's already mastered, and he posts a 28:24. He then comes back again for round 2, the old double whammy, double fisting the Fisherman launch, and gets a 28:21. And it looks like this is going to be very difficult for people to beat, but you'd be a fucking idiot to think that, because then, not long after, Spicy TV comes back and gets a 28:19, also utilizing the Fisherman launch. It's now obvious to everyone, if you want any shot of getting in the top 3 of this game, you're going to have to master these launches. There's no other way around it. Day 5 rolls around, and people are miserable trying to get Fisherman launch to be consistent instead of being a stubborn bitch that it was, and as they say, pressure makes diamonds. Through desperation came salvation, with the now iconic trick that I think Amok Runner is known for, cock skip. Discovered on day 5, cock skip uses the exact same fundamentals as the Fisherman launch, but it's much closer to where you start, and it's also much more consistent. So it works by getting on your bike after Linda leaves, and instead of going to where the Fisherman is, you come over to this bad boy who's feeding his chickens. You line up your bike in a precise way, but it's a very consistent and pretty easy to get lineup. And then you get off your bike, and when he collides with you, open your map, and it'll launch you directly to the train station. It's faster than Fisherman launch, it's more consistent, and it's got a cooler name. Cockskip became a staple in the community. Now I should explain why the runners open their map during these launches. The reason they open the map is because it slows down the in-game time but also increases your frames, which lead to longer launches, higher launches. If you don't open your map, you don't nearly go as fast or as far or as high as you would had you opened it. So that's why you're going to see that for every single launch. And there is a lot of them. Now, cockskip being a massive discovery leads to a lot of people spending day 5 just getting good at it. There's a couple new records that are posted, once again traded by Spicy TV and Zach. Spicy gets a 28:14 shortly after a 28 flat, and then Zach gets the first sub 28 with a 27:57, and then finishing the day with an absolutely beautiful, super squeaky clean 27:47. He's only using cockskip and Linda skip, and he's already in the sub 28 category. He's breaking records, he's breaking dicks, he's doing an incredible job. Zach777 is thought to be the Amok Runner god. Day 6 rolls around, and people are hungry to find a way of skipping one of the most tedious sections of the game, the crane puzzle. There's a good handful of puzzles throughout the run, many of which are solved almost instantly by the runners because they've mastered exactly the amount of key presses they'll need, and they're not an issue. But crane puzzle, no matter how fast you are, how smart you are, how quickly your little fingers can move around, it doesn't matter, because that crane only operates on the slowest possible speed imaginable. It is brutal, boring, and long, and from the very beginning, day 1, people knew that theoretically you could skip this because doing the crane puzzle is not an objective. Thus, skipping it is not a sequence break. You could skip the puzzle and still do the current objective, meaning there'd be no issue. But the problem was, even if you could launch over the crane puzzle and get to the house behind it, which is your objective, the problem is the crane puzzle's still not solved, meaning you can't leave. So you had to find a way to launch in to the house over the crane, and then launch out over the crane to the next objective, which is the mansion. There were actually a lot of discoveries that ended up not being used in runs, but seemed to have a lot of potential. One of them's called car teleportation. So there's actually this really interesting system in this game where when it thinks you're stuck, you can reset your position. Some glitch hunters discovered that you could actually cheat this by just holding onto the parking brake and making the game think you're stuck to reset your position to pretty much wherever you want it to be, as long as it was a flat surface. So you'd hold the parking brake, you'd set a position, then you'd drive somewhere else, and then do the same thing again, and it'd reset you back at the first position that you set. However, this didn't end up being useful because you'd still have to solve the crane puzzle, and it'd only give you a head start getting to the mansion, which really wasn't worth the effort. But I still think it was a cool discovery. Now, what ended up happening is on day 6, people did finally find a way of skipping crane puzzle and then skipping all the way to the next objective, the mansion. So this was a series of glitches that were found pretty much back to back, and they are brutal and unforgiving. By far, this is the most difficult part of the run because unfortunately it relies a lot on just some good RNG at the end of the day. Like, there's only so much you can control. It's fucking awful. So the first is cone launch. Cone launch is where you're gonna drive your car over past this construction worker and then gently squeak this puppy on over this traffic cone. You want it right behind your headlight, and then you wait exactly 10 seconds. On the 10th second, you bring up your map, and then you're gonna have a launch. The traffic cone is gonna send you to fucking space. Your car is going to be freaking out. It's going to be like spaghettified as if it's going through a black hole. And ideally, it lands over this out of bounds line and on top of the checkpoint in front of the house. If you do this, you've skipped the crane puzzle, and now you're at the next objective, and you've saved like fucking a minute and 10 seconds or something. It's a big chunk. But it's not easy because the traffic cone's not always going to fling you in the exact same spot every single time. Sometimes you don't make it fully over the out of bounds, sometimes you make it too far, sometimes you fall on the other side of the gate, and if that happens you can't save it. And also the car's this absolute unrivaled mess of a contraption where it can just get stuck in the goofiest position. So if you hit like any of the rocks or the barrels here, you're gonna get stuck and you can't get it out. So there's just so many variables at play that you have limited control over. So cone launch is absolutely rough. And whenever someone hits cone launch, the whole community goes in to watch to see if they can clutch out the next part of the run, which is by far the most unforgiving glitch I've ever seen in any game I've ever tried to speedrun. I've speedrun like 100 games by now, and I've never had a glitch be this much of a piece of shit. So after hitting cone launch, which is no easy task, you then go through the objective as normal in the house. You line up some pictures, you grab a revolver, you shoot 2 men dead in cold blood, murder 2 dudes, then you get back in your car, and then you drive the car over this log. This is called log launch. By getting your car stuck on this log in the perfect position and getting out of the vehicle, you can get a lucky collision that will launch you upwards and flings you all the way to the mansion on the other side of the map. It's extremely inconsistent, and it's also extremely difficult to navigate even if you do hit the launch, because the camera gets all wonky, it gets all fucking cattywampus, so it actually inverts itself, which changes the controls, and the high speed makes it really disorienting. So it's extremely hard to actually control yourself even when you do get the launch because of all the camera fuckery going on. But it can launch you all the way to the mansion and save you so much time. So hitting these 2 tricks back to back became integral for getting the world record, and some madman actually put together a run on day 6 utilizing both. His name was Thirsty Jacobo. The run itself wasn't the cleanest, but hitting these 2 launches, which no one else up till this point had done, was enough to get him world record with a 27:35. And a lot of people actually thought this might end up being unbeatable just due to the pure inconsistency of those 2 tricks. But as is always the case when it comes to speedrunning, new methods were discovered. On the next day, a runner named Bob Toad discovers a new way of doing the same mansion launch that doesn't use the log. The log was extremely inconsistent, and it really was just a complete gamble if it was going to launch you, but Bob Toad utilized something called plank launch. He did the exact same trick with cone launch, and then after doing the objective normally, getting back in his car, instead of driving to the log, he drove to this pile of planks. And this is a much more consistent setup. So you drive your car onto the planks, and you want to line up your back wheel in between these 2 planks on the far right. And if you do that, it'll launch you most of the time, but even then it is still pretty RNG reliant because sometimes it'll just launch the car to the fucking stratosphere, but a good chunk of the time it'll launch you. It's an easier, more consistent setup, and it's a better position to get, and Bob Toad utilizes this plank launch to get the first sub-27 run. This is when things are getting really sweaty. We already have some runners that put in 100 hours in the first 8 days, and their talent is starting to show. Bob Toad has the current world record at this point, but then we have the old guard coming back. It's none other than Spicy TV, who comes in with one of the biggest gaps in the entire competition. Spicy TV utilizes the exact same tricks as Bob Toad, but since he had already mastered every other facet of this run, he's able to cleanly get a 25:51. He used all the same tricks, but the difference here was just in how much he's practiced every other angle of the game. Better shooting, better, quicker puzzle solving, better lines, getting from point A to point B, better boss fight. Spicy TV just put it all together into an absolutely tremendous run. At this point, we're 9 days in, and the pressure is really starting to be felt by the entire community. Distortion 2, who's now spent the majority of his time practicing all the tricks, is now starting to bang out runs, and they're looking scary for the rest of the community. The leaderboard's not changing nearly as much. The best runners have already been carved out here, and they're now just competing with one another to try and maintain a top 3 position. There's not a ton of movement, however. From days 9 to 11, there were 2 new world records. The first was achieved by Ouija, who comes in, slaps his meat on the table, and lets his presence be known, clocking a 25:42. He's using all of the same strategy as the other runners, he's just cleaning everything else up around the launches. After Ouija gets a 25:42, Zach777 comes in once again, showcasing why he's been here for so long, and he gets a 25:33. This run was a triumph for all of humanity. Most people believe Zach has just got an unbeatable world record because it almost looked perfect. There wasn't any glaring issues, no big fuck-ups or anything. It looked like a run that would stand the test of time. And it almost did. On day 13, Distortion 2 finally gets his big magnum opus of a run, getting a 25:38, which secures second place. He's now behind Zach going into the final day. He's in second place. He looks primed to take home at least 2.5k. But on day 14, Bob Toad comes in and sweeps the rug out from under him. Just absolutely pulls the wool over his eyes and gets a 25:37, kicking Distortion to third place right at the finish line. With 2 hours to go, Distortion's run is treading water, but he's still doing runs. He's still cranking out runs, hoping to improve his time, hoping to even get first place. But right now, he's hanging on by just a fingernail. He's got one fingernail on the nipple, and he's still trying to suckle from that titty. And then the clock's ticking down even further. With 2 hours to go, Ouija does the unthinkable. Putting into practice everything he's learned for the past 14 days, utilizing 150% of his brain power, Ouija gets every launch, first try, perfect trajectory, perfect landing, hits everything outside of the launches perfectly, except for the boss fight. The boss fight was a little bit of floundering, making it extremely close, but getting a 25:36. 32, 1 second faster than Zach, taking first place with only 2 hours before competition close. This also kicked Distortion from 3rd place to 4th, but Distortion wasn't down in the dirt yet. He wasn't buried 6 feet under. He actually had some tricks up his sleeve. Distortion had practiced all of the glitches more than anyone else in the competition, I would argue, and he was ready to let that shit rip. He had a few very promising runs within the last 2 hours, and he tried utilizing some absolutely brutal glitches, one of them being Chinatown Skip. Chinatown Skip is yet another launch that skips from Mansion all the way to Chinatown, which is where the failed abortion takes place. It's another pretty long road from Mansion to Chinatown, so the skip does save quite a few seconds. And during a couple of his runs, Distortion tried to implement that to make up the difference in order to squeak out world record at the end. But it wasn't just Chinatown he had at his disposal. Distortion had actually discovered something that he called bowling, where after the boss fight, he could skip a lengthy animation by getting hit by a car and tumbling forward. This would actually save even more time. And then at the very end, there was always Moist Skip, which is another 4-second time save. So putting Chinatown Skip, the bowling, and Moist Skip all into this run, Distortion did have a chance to get world record at the very end. But unfortunately, it just wasn't in the cards. He had a handful of very promising runs, but they fell apart on Chinatown Skip. He missed it twice, and he finished in 4th place, just outside of the prize money. This competition was absolutely amazing to watch. I couldn't be happier with how all of it went, and I hope everyone had a great time. I know the glitches were fucking rough, and I know the game was quite interesting, to say the least, but I am extremely excited to continue doing this, and I hope all of the runners that competed in this one will compete in the future bounties that I put out. The next one I'll announce in the next few days, and I hope you all enjoyed this breakdown of the Amok Runner Speedrun $10,000 Bounty World Record Super Duper Turbo Challenge Extraordinaire. It was fucking great. That's about it. See ya.